A warm welcome and thank you for joining us on the program. I am Folashade Ogurinde. It's good news for Nigeria as the nation's economy is slowly easing out of the economic crunch it experienced in 2020 occasioned by COVID-19 pandemic. This comes as the latest report released by the National Bureau of Statistics shows that Nigeria's gross domestic product grew by 5.01% year-on-year in the second quarter of 2021. According to the report, the 5.01% marks 3 consecutive quarters of growth following the negative growth rates recorded in the second and third quarters of 2020. But is a rise in GDP growth sustainable, and do these figures indicate an improvement in Nigeria's economy? Johnson Chuku, the CEO of Kari Asset Management Limited, and Wilson Erumebo, a senior economist at the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, NESG, joins me now on the program. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. I'll start with you, Mr. Chuku. Now, the GDP growth for Q2 2021 has been tagged as impressive by many. Do you agree, and how significant is this growth for the nation's economy?
Ordinarily, one would have said that it was an impressive growth because moving from a growth rate of 0.51% in the first quarter of this year to a growth of 5.01%. I mean, moving from 0.51% to a growth of 5.01% was quite significant. But the key thing, like you asked, what are the factors that underline that growth? The growth was largely from what you may call base effect, from the fact that the GDP figure in second quarter of last year contracted by 6.1%. So moving from a period where there was almost total lockdown of the economy to a period in the current year where economic activities are resumed. So you are measuring a base that was almost zero with a base that had some economic activities. And that's why we saw such material increase in GDP growth rate, because of the impact on the economy of the contraction we recorded in the second quarter of last year.
Well, now, Mr. Erumebo, we certainly have a lot to thank for the easing of lockdown to the economic growth we're experiencing now, don't we?
If you look at the numbers, you realize that we recorded some significant growth in the second quarter. And of course, coming up to this is the fact that the economy was hit, severely by the COVID-19 pandemic. And there were lots of interventions, lots of lockdowns, social restriction rules that were implemented by the government. So over time, particularly from the second quarter of 2020, the third, fourth, and the first quarter of 2021, we've seen how some of these lockdown rules are being relaxed, and we see people getting back to normal. Some sectors that were heavily affected by the pandemic, we've seen how they've adjusted, in a bit. Activities have improved. Sectors like the arts, entertainment, cinemas, and the likes, were shut for a long time in 2020. So things are getting back gradually to normal. That's part of why we saw this significant increase. But I must say something that why we grew significantly, by 5.5%, is mainly because of the lockdown, the base effects. So how GDP is calculated is you compare this quarter, the second quarter of this year, to the second quarter of last year. And if you recall, the lockdown started actually in March and April of last year. So what that means is that there were basically no or very little economic activities in the second quarter of 2020. So it means that if you compare what's happening now in the second quarter of this year to that quarter, of course, you would see a very significant growth, and that's what we've seen.
Now, Mr. Chiku, it's quite interesting to note that, as usual, the non-oil sector contributed a large chunk to the Q2 GDP growth. Please tell us more about that.
Yes, to understand that growth in the non-oil sector, you have to look at the major contributors to that sector. And the major contributors to that sector are manufacturing. Let's start from the telecommunications sector. Of course, the largest contributor to the non-oil sector is agriculture sector, which accounts for about 22% of the GDP. Agriculture sector grew by only 1.3%. Then you have the trade sector. Trade sector is actually the third in terms of contribution to the GDP, contributed about 16.66% of the GDP. It grew by about 22%. And then you have the telecommunications sector, the information and telecommunications sector, that account for about 17.92% of the GDP, and which is the second largest contributor to the GDP. It grew by 5.55%. So these are the major propellers of the growth in the GDP. The other sector that grew faster than these sectors, one of which, the manufacturing sector, I'm not mentioning the manufacturing sector. Manufacturing sector grew by 3.49% and account for just about 9% of the GDP. Then the fastest growing growth sector we saw was the transport and storage sector, which grew by about 76%. And that growth, of course, like I said, was a base effect driven growth, because in the second quarter of last year, there was almost complete shutdown of transportation facilities or transportation infrastructure. You realize that commercial airlines were not operating, transport operators, commercial haulage, passenger vehicles were not operating. So, and that was why you saw that large growth in the transport and storage sector, which also could explain the growth we saw in the trade sector. Of course, we know the trade sector had been in recession for more than 3 years, but for the first time, it recorded a positive growth and grew as high as 22%. So I think these key sectors are the major contributors to the growth. We have the non-oil sector, growth of 6.74%, and a lot have to do with the base effect, the fact that last year we did not have significant economic activities in the second quarter of last year.
A closer look at the report shows that some industries in the non-oil sectors reversed roles, as some who saw an increase in 2020 declined in the first and second quarters of 2021. What do you make of this, Mr. Arimebo?
Well, that has always been the trend, especially when you look at the share of GDP. The oil sector accounts for just 10% or sometimes less, 8%, 9% or thereabout. So the non-oil sector has been very instrumental as far as GDP is concerned. But of course, for other indicators like export and co, oil plays a key dominant role. So if you also going back to the lockdown and to some of those restrictions that we had, the non-oil sector was among the sectors that suffered the most, compared to crude oil as well, because in the non-oil sector you have so many subcategories. You have agriculture, you have manufacturing, you have services, all under this sector. So it's very broad. Services sector is the one of the largest, in terms of contribution to GDP. You have sectors like education, trade. Trade is very significant. I mean, these sectors were severely hit. I mean, people couldn't fly around because of the restrictions. So as activities begin to improve and we begin to open up, that's part of why we see that the sector improves. So basically, the sectors that were severely affected in the second quarter of 2020 are the ones that would show positive growth in the second quarter of 2021. If you also look at some of the performance of key sectors, you would realize that some sectors, like for instance agriculture, is really not doing well. If you compare it to what we had, even when we had the lockdown, agriculture grew by 1.6% in the second quarter of last year, 2020. Now it grew by 1.3%. And that's a slowdown in growth. So what that basically tells us is that issues relating to insecurity, food production, and high cost of logistics are still very prevalent in the economy. So these numbers basically, I mean, if you look at sector by sector, you'd realize that some sectors actually didn't really do well. ICT used to be a very significant, important sector as far as growth is concerned. It grew significantly. Even with the pandemic, it was one of the fastest growing sectors because a lot of people, migrated and started using some of these digital platforms, to communicate and all that. So some of those reflected in this sector's performance. But like I said earlier, if a sector did badly in the second quarter of 2020, it's most likely going to do well in the second quarter of 2021. The reverse is also the case. Sector that posted, very strong growth in the second quarter of 2020 are also not doing very strong growth in this quarter. So, like ICT that I mentioned is growing just 5.5. It grew just by 5.5% compared to double-digit growth that it's always recorded in the past GDP result. So some of these things, perhaps we might also need to wait for the figures of Q3 and Q4. Obviously, Q3 figures will not be as high as what we've seen because some of the relaxing of the lockdown rules started in the third quarter of 2020.
We'll take a break here, but when we return, we will take a look at some major highlights of the NBS GDP report. Please stay with us.
Corruption not in my country.
Hello? Yeah, I found your wallet in front of a supermarket. Meet me at Apple Junction. Yes, I'll be waiting for you.
Now we find out. Two of us.
Thank you very much, officer. It's surprising that men like you still exist in the police force.
Yes, so...
Oh, yes.
This is just a token of my appreciation.
Oh, no. You don't need to do this. We're only doing our job.
Thank you very much. God bless you.
You're welcome.
Now I know police is really my friend.
Yes.
Friend. Hey. Okay, which came up with this one now? I don't understand.
You know your problem. You are greedy. I'm a policeman who is doing his job. All forms of corruption in the force. Not in my country.
Corruption not in my country.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, I've been discussing Nigeria's GDP growth of 5.01% for the second quarter of 2021, and my guests have been Mr. Johnson Chuko, the CEO of Kari Asset Management Limited, and Mr. Wilson Erumebo, a senior economist at Nigerian Economic Summit Group, NESG. Thanks for your time, gentlemen. And let's take a deeper look at this report, Mr. Chuko. The oil sector declined in performance in Q2 2021 report. Could you give us an analysis of what happened, especially when we also see a decline in crude oil production?
I think the major thing that happened in the oil sector was bridging of oil transport facilities or infrastructure, which led to a slowdown in crude oil production. If you compare the crude oil production in the second quarter of last year, crude oil production was an average of 1.81 million barrels per day. But in the second quarter of this year, it was only 1.61 million barrels per day. So you saw a decline in production by about 200,000 barrels per day. And that's why you saw a contraction of about high as 12% in the oil and gas sector.
Now, Mr. Erumebo, do you see a consistent decline in oil sector performance to GDP growth?
Well, for crude oil sector, I mean, we've seen consistent negative performance of that sector, over time. And what's basically happening is that we're not doing well in terms of crude oil production, which is one of the key factors you look at when you're computing oil GDP. For several reasons, issues relating to OPEC cuts, the fact that OPEC is also extending some of these cuts and to ensure that crude oil price remains very high. So what that means is some countries are not really gaining from the higher prices of crude oil, especially countries like Nigeria, because to get that high price, you need to reduce output, to be able to ensure that the market is not flooded with too much of crude oil. I mean, because it's a demand and supply driven market. So that in itself means that the oil sector will continue to face, significant pressure as some of these continue to play out. I mean, there are also other issues as multinationals looking at divesting away from Nigeria So perhaps the PIB Act, which is passed, we're all optimistic that maybe this is one step in the right direction to draw attention to the crude oil sector and attract investments, the much needed investment to be able to boost output. I mean, the question is, even if OPEC relaxes some of these, production cuts, can we even meet up to the demand and produce to export to other countries? I mean, that's something that we need to look at in detail.
Well, Mr. Chukwu, do you envisage further growth in Q3 and Q4 2021?
Yes, we could see further growth in GDP, but it will not be as steep as what we saw in the second quarter of this year. If you recall, the third quarter last year, the GDP contracted by about 3%, close to 4%. So that contraction was less than what we saw in the second quarter, we contracted by 6.1%. So any growth that is coming from that base may not be as steep as what we have now. But the fourth quarter, by the time we get to the fourth quarter, we're going to see a slowdown, drastic slowdown, because if you recall, fourth quarter last year was a positive. The GDP grew by 0.11%. So by the time we get there, we will still see positive growth, but I think the growth rate is going to taper as we approach the end of the year.
Well, one last question before I let you go. Are we likely to see a more impressive GDP performance for the remaining quarters of 2021?
Yeah, so before I move to Q3 and Q4, well, if you even compare the performance of Q2, that's the second quarter, that we're celebrating 5% or thereabout. If you compare that with the previous quarter, so you're just basically looking at how did we even perform, comparing the second quarter to the first quarter of this year, the same 2021, you'd realize that the economy grew by, declined actually by 0.8%. GDP growth, we had a negative growth of 0.8%, which means the first quarter of this year was better than the second quarter of this year. 5% that we're celebrating is basically looking at the second quarter of this year, comparing it to the second quarter of last year when we had lockdown. So what that tells you is that, economic activities, on a quarter-on-quarter basis has not really improved. If you then go and look at the breakdown of all the sectors, performance, comparing them to the previous quarter, that's the first quarter of this year, you still see, a lot of sectors, are still recording negative growth. Real estate, finance, storage, manufacturing, and the likes, they all performed poorly when you compare them with what happened in the first three quarters of this year. So that tells you that there's still a lot of work to do as far as recovery is concerned. Now, going forward into the quarter we're in now, Q3 and Q4, I believe strongly that we won't have a 5%, type growth in the third quarter of the year. Why is because in the third quarter of last year, which of course we use as a benchmark to compute the GDP growth, we started seeing some improvements. GDP, although we saw a decline, minus 3.6%, but it was still better than minus 6% that we recorded in the second quarter of last year. So what that means is if economic activities improve gradually, you would see a situation where growth rate would decline, and that's what we expect to see in subsequent quarters.
Well, as always, gentlemen, thank you so much for your contributions and for your time. I need to wrap on the program. See you again next week. Bye-bye.